In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your own wet palette from 3 simple things in your own kitchen. Coming up after this. How's it going on, guys and girls? Welcome back to Burnt Aquila Painting. My name's Graham and welcome to the channel. In this video, we are making our own wet palettes. But first, if you've seen my videos before and you like what I do here, consider hitting that subscribe button, guys. It really helps the channel out and you don't miss out on any of my future content. So what is this video all about? This video is all about how I make my own wet palette, and I want to show you guys how you can make yours as well. And it is dead simple and dead cheap. I made a video a couple of weeks ago about 5 things on how to improve your painting, and one of them was to get a wet palette. And thinking back on that video, I thought, well, why don't I show you guys how I made mine? So let's get into it. What is a wet palette? They are actually really simple. A wet palette is a type of palette that uses water and a little bit of science to help keep your paints wet for longer. All you need is 3 simple things: a Tupperware container with a lid, some parchment paper, and some absorbent material like sponge. And that's all you need. So why do we use wet palettes? Well, we use them to put paint on. The real reason is that we all use acrylic paint in our hobby, and one of the attributes of acrylic paint is that it dries really quick. Now when the paint's on the Mini, that's a really good thing, but we all know how much paint we've wasted when the paint has dried out on our palette before we've even used it. Now this is where the wet palette comes in. It uses moisture to prolong the work time of acrylic paints, saving us money on paints and extending our work time. Making your own wet palette is actually really simple. As we've looked at, it's only some simple components, and most of them you can actually find in your own kitchen. All you're going to need for a simple wet palette is a sandwich box or Tupperware container. I use a Citadel Grass Tufts container. I like it because it's compact, but it's still got enough space for lots of paint. Also, it's shallow, so I don't have any trouble getting to my paints when I'm using it. Secondly is some sort of sponge. This is going to hold the moisture. It's going to hold the water in your wet palette. I use just normal kitchen sponge cut to size, but I know quite a lot of people like the thin washing up sponges, the colourful ones. They're meant to be really good for this as well. But have a play around with what you like and what you prefer. And last but not least, you're going to need some parchment paper. In the UK, it's called parchment paper, but in the US, it's baking paper, just so you guys don't get confused. For my UK crew, I'm using this grease-proof baking paper from Sainsbury's at the moment. I've got the dimensions written on for my wet palette, so every time I go to cut off a piece, I know how much I need and I don't have to recheck it. This isn't the best stuff though. I don't know if it's because of its grease-proof properties. It does tend to dry out slightly quicker than just normal parchment paper, but I've got 10 meters of it now, so I'm blinking using it. First, take the tub that you have chosen. I found, as I said, a shallower tub will be easier to use, but any tub will suffice if you don't have one. Next, with some scissors, cut the sponge to fit snugly inside your container. If you're using kitchen sponge like I am and have a shallow container, it's worth cutting down the depth of the sponge as well. But the most important part is that it fits snugly. Next is to cut out your parchment paper a little smaller than the inside of your container. So when the water needs topping up in the middle of my paint sesh, I can top up with the squeezy bottle without disturbing the paint on my palette. And now you have all the components for your basic wet palette. It is that simple. But finally, before you put your parchment paper in, you want to add your water. How's it going on, guys and girls? I hope you're enjoying the video. If you are and you're not subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future content. It helps me out, it helps the channel grow. And if you're so inclined, leave a comment and a like. Let me know what you think of the video so far. Until then, peace! You don't want to swamp your container, you want the water to completely saturate your sponge. So a good rule of thumb is that the water level is at the same height as your sponge. This is so you don't overhydrate your paints, but also still keeps them wet. Now you have a basic wet palette, you can paint for longer and it will preserve your paints for days. If you do want to leave your paints for an extended period of time, you're going to find certain things happen. Say you've left some paint overnight, you've put your lid on in your new homemade wet palette, and the next day you come to paint and the water has evaporated and then condensed on the inside of the lid, dripping onto your paints and making them over diluted and useless. There are two different things we can do to prevent this. What we can do is leave the lid off a little bit so the evaporated water can escape, but still keeping the moisture in our paints. Or secondly, you can drill a couple of holes in the corners of your lid. This way it still lets the evaporated water escape, but keeps your paints moist. If you do want to try this, I would start off with a few holes in the corners and then add one at a time in the corners until you get to the point where the condensation on the inside of the lid has started to stop. So we have our wet palettes, they're built, and we know the basics of how to use them. So it's time to get a little bit more nerdy than we usually do in our hobby and ask the question, how does a wet palette actually work? So you have your waterlogged sponge in place with your parchment and your paint on top. The sponge holds the water, and as the moisture from the paint evaporates, the water is pulled up from the sponge through the parchment and into the paint, keeping it nice and moist. So some of you might be asking at this point, if the water can come through the parchment, can't the paint bleed through to the sponge as well? And the answer is no. This is why we needed a certain type of paper on our sponge. The parchment is porous enough to let the small water molecules through to the paint, but not porous enough for the larger molecules that make up the paint to also pass through. Think of it as a narrow one-way street. It's big enough for a car to fit down, but a lorry, a truck for my American friends, won't be able to fit down it. And that's all the science that's involved. The paint molecules are too big to pass through the parchment paper, but the small water molecules are small enough to pass through it. Nice and simple. So before I go, a couple of tips on using a wet palette. I mentioned this one before, but don't overflow your palette. This can be especially easy when you're halfway through a paint session and you think you need just to top it up a little bit more. Just be careful. It's super easy to overhydrate your paints, rendering them completely useless and giving you the coverage of GW's Uriel Yellow. When putting your parchment paper down, it will roll up. Don't worry, this is completely normal. You can either hold it down gently until it sorts itself out, or you can just leave it and it will sort itself out. But don't worry if it starts curling in at first. Thirdly, clean it out frequently. This is something I didn't do at first, and the smell. This is a container full of moisture, and when you put the lid on it, it does get warm in there. And so things start to grow if you leave it too long. So unless you want to find a new type of penicillin growing in your wet palette, clean it out frequently. If this is the first time using a wet palette, just be aware your paints will be a little bit thinner than you're probably used to. You may not, but chances are they will be a little bit thinner. Just be aware of it. Before long, and you get used to it a little bit, you will be flying with the new wet palette. And lastly, if you do get a Tupperware tub which is really deep and you're not enjoying it, flip it upside down. Use the lid as the container, and this is where those thin washing up sponges come in really handy because they're so thin but they hold lots of moisture. That way when you're using your wet palette, you're not struggling to get into your paints. Obviously if you've already put holes in it like mine, don't do it, but it might be something you want to consider before you do that. And that is it. That is how I made my wet palette. That's how I use my wet palette, and a few tips for you guys to get started. What did you think of the video, guys? Let me know in the comments. Have you made your own wet palette? Have you bought your own wet palette? What do you think? Have you used both? What do you think of the two? What are the differences? What are the pros? What are the cons between the two? Let me know. I've never used a purchased wet palette. I've always used the one that I've made myself. So I'll be interested to know your thoughts and feelings, and maybe you can talk me into buying one myself. Thanks again for joining me here at Burnt Aquila Painting. If you like what I'm doing here, like and subscribe, hit that bell icon so you don't miss any of my future videos. Also, if you want to get involved, I do have a Patreon that helps this channel a lot. There's 2 tiers. I won't go into the spiel, you've heard it all before, but check it out, link in the description below. And thanks for supporting Burnt Aquila Painting. That's enough from me, until next time. Peace!